There we go.
Well, there's Richard, and it's actually that's not Richard, but it looks. I thought he just had cats.
There's Richard.
You're muted, Richard.
Yeah, I think that's my wife uses my Zoom account, and I think she
Uh,
set that up as the default photo somehow. Never have changed it back.
I'm not sure we had a notice that we're recording.
Oh yeah, I heard it when
I got one.
yeah.
Yeah.
I just didn't hear it.
Well, all right. Guess we'll just go on. And spreading about the state of the world a lot, but
Oh,
we'll do something else now. A little more interesting and fun.
Yes.
Okay, so I thought what I would do is sort of work through a few more ideas from the interview we were listening to, stuff that's going to tie up more of this conversation about secular and spiritual and what he means by socially available free time. Hopefully, we'll get into a little bit of history, depending on how things go. And then next week, I think I'll end with a different interview and go back to the political implications that he's talking about in the second half of the book. Sure, that's a good way to tie things up. We'll end with where he ends up. All right. So before that gets going, anybody have any lingering thoughts or questions from last week that we should get to? Finish up? No, guess not. Okay. We'll just get into it. Let me queue up the... All right. Let's see what we can... Hold on. Let me find it for you. Find it here first.
At Chewy, it's easy to fuel your dog like a champion. Choose Pro Plan. The food of national.
An ordained minister has decided to give up God for a year. How the heck do you just up and become atheist after being a pastor?
Can't have the joy without the world is not my home. I'm just passing through.
Okay.
My treasures are laid up away beyond the blue. And, I can imagine believers, and I've spoken to some people that are still Christian religious believers about your book.
Okay,
and I believe,
they
would say that they can live this life with commitment and passion, as well as having faith in eternity. How do you respond to questions like that? I'm sure you've heard. Yeah, absolutely. And it's an important question. And to be clear, of course, on my account, people who identify as religious can live their lives with commitment and passion. But the question for me is, the question I'm trying to raise is how we should understand the deepest source of that commitment and passion, And there's a very widespread sense that without the religious sense of eternity or the transcendent, life would be meaningless. And my argument is on the contrary, that there's a sort of secular sense of finitude at the heart of care and commitment, even for those who identify as religious, So like in practice, this is what I'm trying to show, that like what animates that care is a sense of finitude, secular sense of finitude rather than a religious sense of eternity. So that, in practice, caring about someone or something requires both that you believe in its value, that's the first movement of secular faith, but also that you believe that it's fragile and that it can cease to be. So for example, it's because I recognize you as finite, I can understand that you're in need and it matters how I treat you. And more generally, like it's only in the light of risk and failure that we can be committed to sustaining anything that we value, and that fragility is part of what animates the commitment in practice. So, another way of saying that is there's an important theological distinction that I use for secular ends in the book, and that's the distinction between living and dead faith. That
So we did hear
this idea. This is a notion that, as I'm sure it goes from the letter of James to Aquinas and Luther and Kierkegaard, where like the living faith is really the faith on which you're prepared to act. It's a faith that in practice shapes how you're affected by what happens to you. And at its very strongest, that's the faith on which you're ready to stake your life, Whereas the dead faith is something you claim to believe, even though that faith is not manifested by your actions, and even though
you wouldn't make your life depend on it. And one way of thinking about my argument is to say that, like, well, to show that like our living faith is secular in my sense, and invite religious people also to recognize that like in practice what actually animates their passion and their commitments is this secular sense of fragility. Even if they might avow a religious faith, you know, I'm inviting them to consider the possibility that that's a dead faith, whereas the living one is better understood in secular terms.
Yeah, and you use it toward.
Okay, yeah. So that's, yeah, it's really, I think it's a really interesting idea that our commitments all come from the secular, and that religious commitments can't motivate that in the same way, and that it's just sort of a matter of, I guess, I mean, the way he presents it is just sort of like, you know, if you just stop and think about it this way, it's like, yeah, that's what's going on. It's such an important point that it seems like there should be a much more grand argument in defense of the idea or somehow, but he's relying on this being very intuitive to us, that it just makes sense that, well, right, if I have to care about things because they're fragile. And if I don't see them that way, then why I don't care about them. So it can't be that this eternal is what motivates my commitment to doing things in this life. It must be this life that's motivating me to do things in this life. Yeah, so
So
what do y'all
even
think about that?
even though you're religious, well, what first came to mind is, I'm sorry if I offended by these crazy people who believe in Armageddon and end times, and they have to do these 7 pillars that I've heard of, and they want to control the government. I mean, that's a lot of action based on religious faith, it seems to me.
Well, is it based on religious faith, or is it maybe just using that language? I mean, is it?
That's a good distinction, Richard. That's a good distinction.
It's not. Christian people, evangelicals, those are the ones I know the most about. They do exactly what everyone else does, only they just say they're doing it for the Lord. But it doesn't look any different than anybody else.
Because we're all secular, yeah. Because we all live in a secular life, no matter what the religion.
That's a good distinction, though, that they use the religion and the motivation is really something else. Yeah. And the reason I say Christian is because they self-define as Christian. So
yeah, right. The people we're most worried about.
We can say they're not really Christian, but they define themselves as Christian. So
yeah, it is a strange thing. Yeah, go ahead, Alana. Oh, you're muted.
You're muted, Helena.
Okay, sorry.
There we go.
Do we really think that Marx was not, that religious people could not be Marxist or socialist?
Oh no, they're out there.
Yeah, because I remember from my father, and he inherited a lot of Dutch books, and I still have a lot to read. But there is one of it that talks about religion and socialism, and the person who really began socialism was a minister in Holland, a church minister.
Mm-hmm.
So that they must have gotten that idea from Jesus Christ, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's an old idea.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, for Christian thinkers, that's where they'd get it. Yeah.
They don't, but I mean, you don't reject the whole of religion because you think that they can never be socialist.
Yeah, no, I think what Hagglund's really trying to argue is more that you just don't need it.
Right.
Oh.
It might be. No, and in fact, you know, I would I've often remarked that I think the most compelling and brilliant Marxist thinker in the latter half of the 20th century was actually a Catholic theologian named Juan Luis Segundo from Uruguay, an amazingly sophisticated thinker and a priest. and a Catholic theologian. And so but what's interesting is, and sort of in the American context, we have especially a strong version of it that comes in the Catholic worker movement, which was founded by this woman named Dorothy Day. And what they don't articulate it the same way, but in fact they do have something in common, which is to see that their religious commitments should be directed towards social betterment.
Okay.
And the liberation theologians put that in the way they phrase it is that that God has a preferential option for the poor. And so it's arguing that all of their religious ideals and teachings are pointing them in the direction of socialist politics. Because and then they'll go back and see, well, okay, so you're going to say that God has a preferential option for the poor. Why would that be? And one of the first things they point out is, well, Jesus was a poor man. I mean, that God's that in that Christian story, God's most intimate engagement with the world is to engage the world of the poor.
But that enslaves people.
The what?
That enslaves people.
That does. Oh yeah, that's a big idea in there. Yeah. So, but it's for the religious socialists, I think they would say it's their religious values that are undermining their commitment. What Hagglund, I think, would say is that all sounds well and good, but he doesn't really think it's a religious commitment. It's a secular commitment that has religious guise.
Oh.
And so it's just, you find good people everywhere, and some of them are religious and some of them are secular. But if they're talking about making life better for the masses of the poor in the world, then they're doing something very secular. Regardless of what they say their motives are, they're doing something secular. And so they must have some kind of commitment to that as a secular cause, that is the fragility of the masses of the poor in the world, that their lives are fragile and need to be cared for. So it is a finite thing, a fragile thing in the world that is the object of the commitment, even if you want to say the source of it was somewhere else. And of course, standing behind that is a really old idea that people have ethics because they were told to, which is very deeply embedded in a lot of conservative religious thought. That I had a friend of mine actually was telling me, this has been a couple decades ago, but a friend of mine was talking to me about his mother talking about this idea, was that, well, how do secular people have ethics? No one told them what's right and wrong. It's like, well, maybe being a human being, you kind of intuit some of these things. It's a really old idea, goes back to David Hume in the late 1700s. But David Hume had to actually say that. He had to argue that and tell people, maybe it's not that all of this is dictated by God. Maybe our morality is actually from being human. But there's still a lot of people who think that you don't know what's right and wrong unless someone told you what's right and wrong. So
I had somebody at work tell me that if he didn't believe, he would be capable of murdering people.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's a weird idea.
I said, well, I don't believe, and it wouldn't occur to me to murder anybody.
Yeah, and yet we're all capable of murder.
Right. But that somehow, without your belief, it becomes a live option.
Well, if the truth be told, we would probably wish some people dead.
Well, there's that too.
Helena.
It's true though. But he also mentions a whole lot about Martin Luther King.
Oh, we're coming to that next.
Okay.
Yeah, that's actually the very next.
Because that's very interesting.
Okay.
The poor people's march.
It's more on the same theme here. So let's do that.
Okay.
Let me share. Here we go.
For the end of the book, you use Martin Luther King Jr. as sort of a paradigmatic example of this, where his religious sermons tend to be more oriented around the horizon of eternity, but his activism is absolutely focused on the here and now.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I even try to show that there is both a secular and a religious use of the word God in his speeches, you know, so that there's a way in which, like, you know, and here Hegel's idea of faith and the practice of faith is very important to the argument, because like part of Hegel's idea was that like in faith as a practical activity, you know, the real object of devotion is the congregation itself, you know, the community that you build through recognizing one another's dignity and intrinsic value in forms of practices around birth and death and coming together, etc. But the religious...
Okay. This was a new way of understanding Hegel to me. When he lays it out, I can start to see the outlines and maybe why he talks the way he's talking about Hegel, but this is not how most people would understand what Hegel was talking about.
How do most people understand what Hegel was talking about?
Well, Hegel uses the word, in German, it's the word Geist, which means spirit, and in old language might have translated as ghost. Mm-hmm. But spirit is the word that translators use. And Hegel's the way that I would normally explain to students is that Hegel has this idea that God is guiding human history and using our experience of religion through time as a way of sort of teaching us to grow in a direction that's ultimately philosophical, so that the ultimate kind of intellectual development of humans becomes, well, Christianity for him, and then Protestantism in particular, but also Lutheran Protestantism in particular. And then the ultimate achievement of human religious thought is then Hegel's philosophy, which is the ultimate development of this Protestant theological trajectory. And so there is a world we're being pulled towards, and this will come up a little later on, the importance of this language of being pulled, but that by spirit he really means God. And when Hagglund's reading it, when he reads spirit in that language, he's seeing something that's more like what he's talking about. That spiritual in the sense of our intellectual lives and our hopes and desires and all of that. That he sees Hegel talking about that, and that Hegel wants to see then, or celebrate, the development of Prussian society as a kind of secular form that is elevating those spiritual values. And that part's not too off the mark, given the way Hegel seems to be valuing the Prussian society in which he lived. It was a kind of constitutional monarchy for a while, and that seemed to be the thing that Hegel thought was like the best form of organizing human politics. But Hagglund doesn't see the whole system really being driven by spirit in the sense of God. He sees all of it much more secular. So it's a curious reading that way. Well, let's see. But what's that all of this ends up in a secular forum, maybe, is in that it ends in philosophy. It doesn't end in theology for Hegel. That part I can see how what Hagglund's doing is really picking that idea out and running with it really strongly, that it all ends in secular commitments. And so having a society organized around those secular commitments. And so there are left-wing interpreters of Hegel and right-wing interpreters of Hegel, and the right-wing interpreters of Hegel, after Hegel died, wanted to kind of go all in on Prussian society is the best society ever, and this is how the world should be organized. We have to have this monarch who's going to guarantee everything in this strong state. Where the left-wing Hegelians, Marx sort of being among them, saw Hegel as pointing towards something very important, but his conclusions were wrong. You know, it wasn't that society that we're after. We're after something after that society. Anyway, it's not the most important point, but just a little curiosity about how he reads Hegel.
Just understanding of that activity doesn't grasp that that's actually the highest good and what we're actually devoted to and committed to our life together, because it thinks that the ultimate object of devotion is a salvation that goes beyond that fragile life, or it's obedience to a God who commands norms that are external. But there is the possibility of recognizing that what we're actually devoted to is our life together as the highest good, and acknowledging one another as ends in ourselves. And I'm trying to show that, like, you know, much of the Martin Luther King and civil rights movements, like that, the pathos, the significance of how they were deploying practices that have been associated with religion are actually better understood in secular terms in this way. So.
Yeah. Well, you know, I guess my favorite thing about your book is.
Okay. So yeah, he's not going into a lot of details there, but he goes into more detail in the book that you can really break down Martin Luther King's speeches into these two big categories. Is he giving a political speech in which his references are all going to be secular, or is he giving a religious speech, that is a sermon, in which case those references are going to be theological? And it on the surface can sound the same, because he's using God talk in both contexts. But God, you know, Martin Luther King didn't believe in an old man in the sky, right? You know, his sense of God is really more like a principle that we're committed to in the world. I mean, he didn't really think of God as something that acted on the world. It's more God as spirit of inspiration for him, I think, would be a better way of thinking about it. He is definitely a lot closer to those open theology process people I was telling you about. But as a preacher, he's very accomplished at using the religious language in a way that was familiar to his audience. And so even though the references he's making to God are not what necessarily, he's not meaning what the audience is hearing necessarily. But for him, that's not the important point. That detail's not the important point. What he's trying to convey is something more important about values. And so the fact that he has an understanding of God that's different from the congregation he's talking to is not the important point. And it took me a long time to wrap my head around that way of thinking about things, actually, from the preacher's side. Because it turns out my stepfather was a Methodist minister in his early life. He went on to do other things, but he had a small church for a while, and so did the ordinary preaching thing. But he was an atheist, and there was this movement in the 50s when he went to seminary. It was called Death of God, and it was based on a book by a guy named Thomas J.J. Althusser called The Death of God Theology. And so in the 50s and early 60s, there were a lot of Protestant ministers and more Catholic priests, but it was especially a strong movement in Protestantism, who understood themselves to be atheists, but they saw a lot of importance in these religious values and in the traditions and in religious community. And so they just adopted God talk. And so there were times when I could encounter my stepfather talking to people in which he sounds like a believer, but I know he's not from the conversations I have with him at home. And it's like, well, but why are you using that language? And what I have over time come to sort of appreciate is okay, God talk is the inside terminology that clergy and theologians use for that, and they're aware that their audience interprets the God talk in very, very different ways, and they've just accepted that there's going to be a variety of receptions of what they're doing, and it doesn't matter that the audience isn't agreeing with them about that detail. They're trying to convey something else. Still a little. I appreciate it on an organizational level that it keeps things going and it keeps the organization going, but there is a part of me, as the theological part of me, that's sort of like, but shouldn't they understand what you mean? Shouldn't I don't know. So but that's a more abstract point, not necessarily important here. But what King's doing the same thing, he's just discovered there's a power to this language, and even if for him he's talking about a force for goodness, that arc of justice in the universe. That's when he says God, that's actually what he means, is the universe, the arc of the universe bending towards justice. That's his God. And as long as people around him understand that his God is in a sense commanding this justice for the universe to bend towards, and therefore commanding us to participate in creating this just society, that's all that matters. If they think God is an old man in the sky with a big white beard who's ordering people to do this, okay, as long as they're doing it. The important point is actually to accomplish the secular goal of, we're going to work for justice in the world. And so everything else is just in service of that goal. And if the God talk is what you need to accomplish it, then you use the God talk. So it's very pragmatic in that way, which is kind of interesting. What do you think? Does that make sense?
And so Hagglund's saying the same, not saying the same thing, but he has, you can be religious, but it's really secular.
Yeah. It's definitely at every turn he is going to be a little disarming. When you look for him to make a critique of religion, he's going to be a little disarming and say, well, my point is, it's not important. You do you. It's not really important.
Right. I think he'll get his message. Yeah.
Okay. And I love Elena's point that's just Swedish. All right. We're going to go on a little bit here with what the spiritual is about.
The way you weave it all together. I mean, it's I love the pieces of the book, but
Very good way of describing how the book moves. And
then what are we actually going to do about it? Because we don't live alone. We don't even just live with our nuclear family. We live in a society in which everyone, not just me, not just you, but everyone has these same concerns. And we have to negotiate these sometimes conflicting needs and desires in a larger scale society. And so that seems to me how you make, is that fair? Like how you make the transition?
That's beautiful. That's exactly, that's a very good way of describing how the book moves. And intimately related to that, I want to emphasize as a first general point that
success doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from daring to ask the right question.
When I'm talking about the spiritual in the secular sense, it's a very important part of my argument to show that actually spiritual questions cannot even in principle be separated from material questions on how we sustain our lives. It can't be separated even in principle from economic questions, which shouldn't be understood in a limited sense in terms of modern economics, but in terms of economic questions, that's questions of what is valuable, what is worth doing, so it's really also about the inseparability of material and spiritual life, spiritual and economic life. And that's where Marx becomes really important, because through his work, I think I'm trying to show that there are great resources to think on every level what it means that to lead a spiritual life is not to repose in some sort of contemplative peace, but it is to be engaged and at stake in a life that is essentially dependent on material conditions and therefore essentially fragile, but also essentially social, essentially dependent on others, because none of us, because we're finite, we can't sustain our lives on our own. So there's an interdependence, in terms of how our lives are sustained. And the question is, how are we going to do justice to that?
Yeah, and I feel like in modern
Yeah, so here you need to keep in mind this contrast that the heavy contrast he wants to make with the religious ideal of isolated contemplation, and there are examples of it in East and West, that the Buddhist monk or the Shinto monk. There are Shinto monks who still do this, go off and live in a temple in the mountains somewhere, and the only people they see are anybody who's I'm getting old, I'm forgetting words. When you make a pilgrimage, any pilgrims who might come to see them, so it's a really isolated kind of lifestyle. But that's the point for them is to have this isolated life in which they spend their time in contemplation of the divine. And there are Christian versions of it, not as many. Every once in a while there are a Jewish version shows up in history, but they're pretty rare. Islam has some, but Christianity definitely has a lot more of this.
There was a Greek saying, and maybe it's in English too, but a monk prayed to God and said, "Show me somebody who's holier than I am. I pray every day, I fast, etc." And then he pointed to the man on the street who is a good person and said, "He's holier than you are because he's out in the world."
Oh, interesting. Wow. There's actually a saying. Huh.
Yeah. That's,
oh. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I've heard variations on that idea, but I hadn't heard of it actually being a saying that the language had captured.
Well,
but that's definitely that's definitely Hagglund's thinking there. It's weird. I mean, again, the soft sell, right? It's not that he wants to condemn the person who chooses that lifestyle as much as he wants to say, well, there might be better things to do with your time. Maybe there are things that actually matter in the world, and you should spend your time working on those, rather than hoping that God will just take care of them while you're sitting alone doing nothing.
Right.
So, if that's what you want to do, you do you. But maybe you might get more done if you're out working with people. That kind of thing. Yeah. So it's real. I find this book really fascinating that way because of the soft sell of it. It's just such an interesting approach in religious conversations. Okay, other questions? All right, no, I think that's good. All right, let's take up something a little different here. Going to go on to this bit about what he calls socially available free time. Well, I guess the important, I don't want to let go of his point about emphasizing that it's important to actualize all of these things. I get, that the emphasis needs to be on how are we going to make it real if we're going, and in a way, I think it's interesting that there's a sense in which it's kind of like a matter of self-respect, that as a person who is, as he describes it, a spiritual person, then I should really take seriously what that means, and that it has a context, and so it needs a context, and if I have the material comfort to act on my spiritual commitments, one of them ought to be to recognize that everyone deserves that. And so part of my commitments should be working on everyone being able to have that same kind of material foundation so that their spiritual lives can be free to pursue whatever matters to them. So which is going to be that's the important point when he brings in Marx usually is to emphasize that it's about enabling everyone to do this and not just for me to be able to do that. All right, let's see. Whoa, where'd the little button go? Let's see here, skip up just a little bit.
Say,
Absolutely. Although I would say that even our, it depends what we mean by politicizing our free time, but it's very important that in my terms, free time should be understood as socially available free time. And that also means that you can't have free time on your own, both because free time is created by, is freed up by the work of society as a whole,
right,
in allowing you to have free time. But it's also social in the sense of like that all meaningful activities that I would count as free because I can see them as ends in themselves are social activities. Even if I sit alone in my room and write my book, whatever, like that is not meaningful and it's not intelligible as a free activity, except in relation to others who would recognize it and who I'm trying to address, and in relation to whom I understand myself. So it's very important for me that we don't have an opposition between the individual and the social,
right,
and we shouldn't feel like we have to choose between them. So neither reduce, so like, and this what Marx called like, we are essentially social individuals. So how to think that those two things together.
Together, yeah. So you a second ago mentioned Marx and.
Okay, let me just skip a little bit. We're just going to catch up a little more on the same idea.
Threads there, and we can follow up on that. I mean, you know, the starting point for me is that to think about Marx as someone who is pursuing questions of time and freedom and value on a very fundamental level, and then leading up to very concrete political questions. But the starting point really for Marx's thinking is that like all living beings generate a surplus of time, as we talked about before. Like, you know, the cat has free time, you have free time, in the sense that like no living being has to spend all its time on surviving. There's some free time to do something else. But what interests Marx from early on is precisely this question that we already touched upon, that like, unlike other animal species that we know of, such as our domestic cats, we can treat that surplus of time as free time and ask ourselves what we ought to do with it, what is worth doing with it, you know, what we should do with it, what is worth doing. That fundamental question of spiritual freedom opening up. So that there is such free time in some minimal sense is a feature of our lives. But Marx is interested in what are the conditions of possibility for owning that question, both individually and collectively. And that's really the basic motivation behind Marx's critique of capitalism and his call for a different form of social life. That, you know, to lead a free life in a substantial sense, it's not enough that we have formal rights to freedom. We also must have access to the material resources, forms of education that allow us to own and engage that question of what we ought to do with our lives and what we ought to do with our time together.
Right.
So what is our own in the sense, and the notion of, even though Marx is famous critical of property, you know, he's very interested in the question of like, what is our own and what we can make of our own, but what is our own is not property or goods, it's this time of our lives. So
right.
And in that way, I would say that like Marx allows us to pursue in the deepest possible way this commitment to our life together as the highest good. What would it mean to live?
So, what are you going to ask the wizard for, Pixel? Well, I'm not sure he's such a...
In explicit recognition of that our life together is the highest good, and our responsibility for one another is the highest vocation. And that's really what emancipation and the overcoming of capitalism is about, on my account.
Yeah, and answering that question of...
Okay, so is that all pretty clear? Sort of need a material foundation. Do we need an example?
Yeah.
No, I mean, what occurred to me actually, and just now when I was listening to it was, you know, this is what the movement for the 8-hour day was all about. You know, the reason political groups and unions would spend so much effort and so much time agitating and protesting for there to be limits on a defined workday is to have free time. You know, the factory system, you know, think about Dickens, you know, describing the factory system in London. You know, the people trapped in that in the end don't seem to actually have any free time at all. You know, their whole lives are either being at work or sleeping in order to get enough rest to go back to work. And then they're doing that, you know, working 14 hours a day or 16 hours a day, and they're doing it 7 days a week. There is no time to be a human being in there. And so the first move this radical politics makes is to say, no, we have to set limits so that people actually have free time at all. And then now, once you have that, then you can start asking other questions. Well, all right, no, what else do people need to be able to be free, to experiencing themselves as free? Well, they need an education. They're going to need a house. They're going to need food. Helena, you had a question? You're muted.
Free time was given by the churches on Sunday.
Right. Yeah. Which actually is an interesting thing that religion noticed a long time ago. And this occurred to me actually. I was driving down towards White Center in West Seattle, and I noticed this taxi on the side of the road. It's like a warm summer or spring day. Noticed this taxi on the side of the road. And it's like, well, okay, well, that's kind of odd. Why would a taxi be there? And then I noticed there's a guy on the sidewalk bent over. Oh, and he has a prayer mat, prayer rug. Oh, there's a Muslim praying. It's time for prayers. And it just sort of hit me as like, you know, if you're a devout Muslim, Islamic law is already dictating that you have to have a certain amount of time set aside during the day, every day, that you can't work. Your employer can't demand you work because you have to go to prayers. And then the same thing is actually true about festivals and religious holidays, that if it's set aside as a day that you don't work, it's time that the religion has kind of clawed away from business interests, however old those business interests were, because this goes back to Judaism doing this.
Right. I was going to
3,000
say.
years ago, 4,000 years ago. So it's something religion noticed a long time ago, was if we set actual limits on what people's time is, we can create free time for them.
Yeah, but it wasn't really free time. You're supposed to be praying or going to church or
Well, but after it, then you would have a meal together with people.
Well, that's true. You do get.
Yeah, so the religion is definitely put its mark on all of this, but it is at the same time, I think, setting aside more time than it actually needs, which is a way of acknowledging people need free time too.
Except that it's not.
It's interesting how religion can do this.
I remember, I think I was in high school when shops began opening up on small town, that everything was closed on Sunday.
Well, not only that, the way I grew up, we weren't allowed to do any, like housework or there were certain things we still couldn't do. You're supposed to kind of sit around and praise the Lord all Sunday.
Sorry.
What is it in Judaism, Richard, that folks do on the Sabbath? Do they have to pray?
Well, you would be expected to go to the synagogue, but in the Jewish tradition also includes that one of the things you're supposed to do on the Sabbath is have sex with your partner.
Oh, I didn't know that.
That's a good thing to do. So you have and then you're not working. You can't do your normal work. So I mean as the tradition develops, it takes on a weird kind of its own oppressiveness in the Orthodox, where suddenly life sort of gets shut down. So instead of it being free time, it's sort of this other thing that can be difficult to negotiate. But but work, even in that rigid a context, I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone that would say playing a game is work, so you shouldn't do it, even if it's physically demanding. You're going out and play a soccer game. So in theory,
But that's
you at least you're setting aside time for all kinds of things.
except the way I grew up, the way I soccer on Sunday, you couldn't have fun. You
I think that's it's evolved it's taken on a form in which it's that idea has lost track of the original impulse that it's about freedom, and it's become this other thing.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, no. Yeah, my Mormon grandparents were the same way. Sundays were an astoundingly boring time because somehow they determined that you weren't supposed to do things.
Yeah.
That's hard on a kid.
Yeah. Bad.
Well, you've had all kinds of religious traditions in your history.
That's part of why I think I study it is different exposures were fascinating to me at different times. I mean, I definitely learned from my Mormon grandparents the value of community and how religious community is a powerful thing. And so I learned to appreciate that there.
How about child labor?
Yeah.
When did child labor become an offense? Because that is not really that long ago.
No. It's probably just a little over 100 years ago. A lot of it.
Well, it's still going on in a lot of places anyway.
Yeah, they lowered the working age in the South.
Yeah. So people trying to bring it back. Yeah, it's a disturbing response, to what business experiencing labor problems, and so putting that on children.
But that's the thing about capitalism, because even the kids that are in a teen age, they're expected to get a job because that makes them strong individuals. They know how to work. Where I was brought up, all your duty is to do your schoolwork and that's it. You don't work. That's your duty is to do your best at school.
Yeah.
But that's not the case. The kids are kind of fully loaded here in this country.
It's
way too much.
It's the conditioning to the system that learning to be workers and sort of forced into that.
And to be and to save that up and be it's
Mine's a little unstable. Looks like Helena froze. My computer was acting up just a second ago too. Okay. Oh, you're back, Helena. I think you froze a little bit there.
Oh, well, I just think that stays in. Your children have to learn to work, and there is not this law against them. They have to work because that makes them into capitalists.
Yeah. And if wages are low for the whole family, then the whole family might even need that to survive, and so they're forced into it. And it's a wrong way of handling the problem. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can get to I had one more technical kind of philosophical thing I wanted to get to, which had to do with Hegel and history. So let me do that with our remaining time. Whoop. So 36. Okay.
Mark, so common.
Yeah, it's a very important question. And there's a distinction here, which might sound a little overly philosophical, but it's helpful, that two things tend to be conflated. And that's the idea of causal necessity and rational necessity. So the view that you're describing is this idea that there's a causal necessity of progress, such that we're automatically determined to progress and so on. And that view is sometimes described to Marx. I don't think that there's actually any substance to ascribing him that view. But there's a very different notion of necessity with something like rational necessity, and that's the necessity of not the necessity that, for example, as we talked about, we have the historical achievement of having become committed to the freedom and equality of everyone. And then there's a question, well, what does that commit us to?
Right. Yeah.
Rationally. And that doesn't mean that fulfilling those ideals is causally necessary or is just causally going to be brought about. But there is a rational necessity to holding oneself to those ideals and pursuing their implications and being answerable for them. And it's in that sense, that Marx is interested in, that like there has, what does the historical achievement of our collective commitment to freedom and equality mean, and what's the demand of us? And in light of that, we can then show why the capitalist form of life can't fulfill those promises, why it contradicts those notions of freedom and equality that it also promotes. And that's the way forward in terms of critique and struggling for emancipation. But there's nothing that secures that.
No guarantee.
And very important too, in my view, unlike...
Okay, that's sort of getting to the point. That necessity, there's a different language for that is a little bit more common, which is the Greek word teleology. So telos in Greek means end. So teleology, organized towards an end. And Hegel is often seen as having a built-in teleology. God is drawing everything in history in a certain direction. And so it's going to have one path because God is drawing it on that path. So there's an end, it's organized towards an end. And then when people encounter Marx, at first it can sound like when Marx talks about the end of capitalism and revolution and socialism and communism, that it can sound like Marx is being teleological, that these things are baked into us somehow, that capitalism will do its thing for a while and then it will collapse and there will be socialism, and then socialism will do its thing, and then we'll have sort of the ultimate freedom of with communism, or what he calls social democracy. And that it just happens on its own, in Marx's version because history's doing it, or in Hegel's version because God's doing it. And what Hagglund was just saying is Marx is not saying that. That's a confusion when people encounter Marx, to think that Marx is saying that history has has one path forward and a kind of guarantee that there's only this one path it can take. And that definitely is not Marx's view. But what Marx was saying is that history is pushed along, which is different from history being pulled along, is the important point. And evolutionary biology figured out they needed to talk about this idea, because when people look at things like a thumb and they see how it developed over time in different species, it's sort of like, well, yeah, of course we end up with thumbs, because look at where we started. And so if we start there and you look at the path, it leads inexorably thumbs. But that's not how biology works, right? Biology doesn't tell you what evolution will figure out. It just says evolution will figure something out. And so the word they came up with was teleonomy. It looks like it's being drawn towards an end. So it looks like evolution was heading in this path that inexorably was going to lead towards opposable thumbs. Not true, just looks that way. And so they can call that teleonomy. It has this appearance of being driven towards an end. Now, the reason that's important for Marx is because, I mean, this might be a little controversial, but I'm convinced, at least, and I wrote about this actually in the dissertation, my conclusion of my dissertation, convinced that what Marx is talking about is that human beings have a natural sense of justice, and that when you violate that, they will respond. And it is the fact of humans responding to injustice that pushes history. The difference is you don't know where it'll go when you push on it. When God, for Hegel, is pulling history, you know where it'll go, because God's pulling it towards God's self. You're not going anywhere else, because there's only that one way to go. But when you're pushing something from behind, it might go to the left, it might go to the right, it might go straight forward, it might go up, it might go, you don't know just because you're pushing it that it's going to go straight forward. So there is this sense that history is going to move us along, But Marx is, and Hagglund especially, wants us to be paying very careful attention here that you don't know where it's going to go. And that's why you need to organize and work on it. And politics matter so much, is that you want to make sure that when you're pushing, it goes in the direction you want it to go, in a positive direction, and not go in some backward direction. So teleonomy versus teleology, this is what he was talking about in terms of this different kind of necessity, that a rational necessity just means I'm going to do something because I need to push. The causal necessity is it's going to happen because it has to happen. That's teleology. So that's not operational, but there is a kind of necessity in that, as I'm arguing it, humans are going to respond to injustice, and that will naturally push things. You just don't know where the pushing will take it necessarily.
So going back to, we have these ideals of freedom and equality.
Mm-hmm. The capitalism has been part of developing for us.
Well, interestingly, though, corporations are the least democratic institutions on the planet.
Yep. Yeah. So contradictions. That's how things move. Is history moves through resolving these contradictions. So
that's when I hear people say the government should be run like a corporation, I just cringe.
Yeah, they're not quite getting the picture here. Yeah. Exactly. They're missing the fundamental point that corporations are dictatorships. Yeah. Okay, but anyway, I think that's a philosophical point. I do want to make sure that you're tracking. So are you all okay on that? Causal necessity, rational necessity, teleology, teleonomy, pushing, pulling. Okay. So yeah, and actually, I think in a lot of ways that understanding that what Marx is trying to describe to us is a teleonomy, that there is a history we can take, but we only take it if we make it sure that that's where it goes. That history just doesn't happen on its own, and history happens because we do things. So you have to organize to make those things happen. Okay, looks like we're just about out of time. Anybody have any last lingering questions or comments? Helena, you're muted.
Am I on?
You are on. Yes.
So
but this is probably not very important, but there are people who have a great joy in their lives for work.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they give. And that's never mentioned, that people are really the profession they took. Like, you must have joy in what you did. You chose to do. You weren't forced to do this.
Mm-hmm.
That was the choice you made. But he never seems to mention that.
No, but that's what he talks about with spiritual freedom. That he because he even uses himself often as an example, that he chooses to be a professor and
oh, that's true.
What gives him great joy. And
that's true.
Yeah,
I forgot about that. Yeah,
go ahead.
Isn't evolution, like biological evolution, a little bit different? I mean, it's not teleological.
For sure.
Right, it's teleonomical.
But the way it works is there's a whole lot of different kind of solutions created, and some of them work.
Right.
And those are the ones that last. And so they're the ones that things become.
Right.
It's kind of like it's in the kind of situation, the environment that determines. Yeah, it's driven by the environment.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. So but the idea is that once you get there, it looks like that was where you were supposed to go.
Right.
And it's that illusion that it was supposed to, it was only one way it was going to go. That's an illusion. Yeah.
But it's sort of deterministic in the sense that the conditions are what determine what survives and what dominates.
Yeah, exactly. You knew something's going to happen, and things either work better or not, and then that's going to determine what happened next.
So that makes it.
Traits that get passed on.
That makes.
The teleonomy is looking like it has direction.
Okay.
Teleology, it has direction.
All right.
Yeah. So evolution looks like it has direction, but it doesn't. And history also can look like it has direction, but it doesn't. It just depends where people are pushing hardest. That's where it will go.
It sort of has direction in the sense that the best solution biologically is going to be determined by the circumstances. Like if there's a lot of sun, maybe dark skin is determined to come about because it's a better solution.
Well, see, yeah, but yeah, it can look determined. That's just it. It sort of seems like it's determined. Yeah. But it's not really determined. It just happens to work. So
but yeah, I see what you're saying. There's no mechanism or God that says it's just the circumstances that make it a better solution.
And so the same with history. It's the circumstances and then how people happen to respond. Where in biology, the difference would be how the genes happen to respond. In history, it's how the humans happen to respond. Okay. All right. I'll let you go. We have one more week. We'll go get back to the more overtly political stuff here at the end. And then I'll have to figure out what to do next.
Thank you for all of your hard work.
Yes, thank you, Richard.
My pleasure. It really is my pleasure. I love teaching. I love doing this. Very rewarding that you all keep coming to class. So thank you.
And I'm so grateful to Nan for telling me about you.
Thank you, Nan. All right. See you next week.
Okay.